Good evening and welcome. This is the Chase Special. I'm Andy Hodges. A deliberate, coordinated and well-planned attack. South Africa's president stated this during a Nelson Mandela Day lecture last Sunday when referring to the recent unrest that swept across KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. The president further described the violence as an insurrection, vowing that those behind the failed insurrection would be held to account. Further comments attributed to the South African president, which he subsequently walked back, stated that the ongoing civil unrest was caused by ethnic mobilization. The death toll from recent riots in South Africa has risen to 276, and police are investigating 168 cases for murder, a cabinet minister said on Wednesday. Reports indicate that the unrest started as protests over former President Jacob Zuma's jailing 2 weeks ago in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal, but it quickly escalated into arson and looting and spread to Gauteng province, where the biggest city in South Africa, Johannesburg, is located. The scale of the destruction and loss of life, which commentators allege was partly fueled by poverty and inequality 27 years after the end of apartheid in 1994, was unprecedented. The South African government appears to now have brought the violence under control. The reported economic cost is estimated at 20 billion rand, or 1.37 billion United States dollars in KwaZulu-Natal alone, with the extent of the cost in Gauteng still to be calculated. So, what is the current situation on the ground in South Africa, and what caused it in the first place? What has been the impact on the South African economy and that of the SADC region? Why was the country not adequately prepared to cope with the unrest, and why did it take so long, as critics allege, to get it under control? What are the South African government's plans to hold those allegedly behind the unrest accountable? Has the unrest affected South Africa's standing in Africa, Southern Africa and SADC? Does South Africa's ANC government have a cohesive vision to rebuild and provide a viable future for the generation now and the next generation of her citizens? Discussing South Africa unrest, the aftermath, we are joined tonight by our special guest, Alvin Botez. He is South Africa's Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, live here on the Chase Special. This is the Chase Special, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program, live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Our virtual discussion this evening, South Africa unrest, the aftermath. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network, ZTN. Now, to our millions of viewers joining online throughout Zimbabwe, Africa, Europe, America, the Middle East and Asia, we would like to hear from you. So please join this discussion on our Twitter handle at ZTN News and on our Facebook page, Zim Paper's TV network. So as usual, make sure we hear your voice. Now, joining us virtually this evening to discuss South Africa unrest, the aftermath, it is my pleasure to welcome Alvin Botez. He's South Africa Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. Deputy Minister, welcome to the Chase Special.
Thank you very much, Andy, and also welcome to the viewers of ZTN.
Well, it's a pleasure having you, sir. Now, Deputy Minister, can you please give us an overview of what is the current situation on the ground in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng? Is the situation now under control?
Yes, affirmative, Andy. There has been absolute social stability that we have seen for the past week. That probably is as a result of the rollout of the adequate law enforcement agencies that has been complemented by the South African National Defence Force. But more importantly, the Cabinet of South Africa, under the leadership of President Ramaphosa, has had and has led the convening of social partners, your business, workers, the unemployed, youth and women, to engage on the plight of South Africa, to ensure that this generation become a generation of inclusive prosperity as envisaged by the African Agenda 2063.
Thank you. Minister, Deputy Minister, media reports have stated that the recent unrest was caused by various and sometimes contradictory reasons. The unrest has been called by commentators and politicians either politically motivated or instigated by criminals and criminal gangs, an insurrection and counter-revolution, and finally a spontaneous uprising due to the joblessness, inequality and poverty being experienced by the majority of South Africa's citizens. So, Deputy Minister, your comment. What is the official South African government position on the causes of the unrest?
Yes, no, this has not been social unrest that can be characterized as being spontaneous, Andy. It can't be a social unrest that can be characterized as a result of poverty. This upheaval, social upheaval, is a process that has been carefully engineered through a very resourceful and intelligent attempt to undermine the authority of the state and to dilute our hard-fought young democracy of only 27 years of age. So this has been well played. It is a resource program. And I thought we must be unequivocal when we state that to the rest of Africa and the world.
But Minister, you say that, but in your opinion, is there any truth to comments and research that state that the minority in South Africa still control the economy and the 80% majority have even 27 years after independence been left out in the cold, so to speak?
Look, what is a fact, Andy, is that South Africa continues to be one of the countries in Africa and in the world where you have widening disparities in terms of the inequality gap. So substantively, that remains a factor. And of course, there is a context to that inequality gap. And given the fact that in South Africa, you have what you call a colonialism of a special type, where we have inherited colonial structures, that economic structures that originally, including your economic infrastructure, has been meant to serve the minority in South Africa. So this 27-year-old democratic government have sought to recalibrate over the past 2 decades the type of economic infrastructure and to reintegrate the black majority within the mainstream of the economy. And therefore, and what we have put in place a number of pivotal economic instruments, such as your black economic empowerment. We have put in place your public preferential procurement system to ensure that the black majority becomes infused within the structure of the economy.
So, Deputy Minister, President Ramaphosa described the unrest recently as an insurrection, which appeared to be contradicted by his own defense minister, who told the South African parliament the military saw no signs of an insurrection or attempted coup, but rather a counter-revolution in the form of criminality and thuggery, as she put it. So, DM, is there discord within the South African government?
No, there's unity of purpose and there's clarity of thought. Remember, Andy, let's be unequivocal here and state it boldly that the South African president is the executive president. The line of command in instances of unrest, of conflict, of social upheaval, the singular line of command is given by what you call your commander-in-chief. And what we are having is that there is a political line that President Ramaphosa has put out based on what we call validated intelligent information. Of course, in terms of a particular narrative that the Minister of Defense have engaged, fortunately, she have clarified that particular narrative, that her initial statements that she have made in a committee of parliament has necessarily been taken out of context and does not give an absolute purview of what her perspective was, but she has therefore unequivocally stated her commitment to ensure that the line that the president have given is actually a line that gets universal acclamation. And I am saying to you, and as a member of the executive, that the president has been correct. Remember, South Africa is one of the most comprehensive social security systems in the world, where any child attends schools for free. When the child attends the free school, the child gets what we call nutritional support program. When the child goes to higher education, there's free higher education for all households or families that actually pay or earn less than 350,000 rand per annum. So there is a substantive food security basket and security protection that we have outlined. And that's why we negate from an argument that say this was a common purpose and common cause, and it was just an ordinary grievance about food security. It's not an ordinary grievance. This has been a program that has been geared towards diluting the authority of the state, and that program has been well funded, and it had a particular intelligentsia attribute to it. For that reason, Andy, as we are speaking, our crime intelligence of the South African police services have been able to pinpoint the operations of that type of a group, and arrest, as we are speaking, has been executed. We are a nation that upholds the rule of law, and any particular attempt to dilute the authority of the state will have to be subjected to the due course process of the judiciary.
So, Deputy Minister, I mean, your own President Ramaphosa was quoted as saying, and I quote, "It is quite clear that all these incidents of unrest and looting were instigated. They were people who planned it and coordinated it." He further said the riots were an attempt to hijack South Africa's democracy. "This is not a battle that we can afford to lose," the President said. He also told supporters that instigators had been identified, but he didn't really elaborate. So he said, we are going after them, he said. Minister, who are these alleged instigators? And maybe you could expand on what the South African government plans to do, or to go after them. How do you intend to do this?
Look, Andy, let's first take your audience in confidence to the fact that this has not been an ordinary process where an aggrieved community rose up because of challenges of food security and decided to rob grocery stores of groceries. It has not been that. What you have seen, Andy, is that this has been a process that has been economically driven to lay bare the economic infrastructure of the South African government. For example, everyone knows that the economic heartbeat of South Africa is Gauteng. Everyone knows the central role that KZN, in particular its port outlets, play in terms of being a corridor of trade for the Southern African Development Region and for Africa as a totality. So your destruction of your logistics network, your restrictions of your road network presupposes that this has been a carefully planned a program of trying to dismantle our economic well-being amidst a COVID-19 pandemic that have actually rattled the economic infrastructure of the entirety of the world. So to take advantage amid COVID-19 pandemic for a people that is going through an hardship for nefarious intent, that is highly and very unfortunate. And of course, Andy, we are only 27 years old. We are a young democracy. Never once have we thought as a leadership that there will be those that will be amongst us that will try to dilute the authority of the state.
But Minister, let me just clarify this, and let me understand exactly what you're saying. Are you saying that the joblessness that's evident in South Africa, I believe the numbers are 32.6% unemployed, and also the economic situation of the majority in the country, are you saying that that didn't play any role at all in terms of the looting and what happened during the unrest?
Well, Andy, let us be very clear. In terms of the unemployment trajectory of government, we are of course concerned. We are concerned when the majority of Black people and young people is out of a job. We are concerned because of that issue. But be it as it may, what President Ramaphosa have done is we have put in place a 500 billion rand economic stimulus package to look at youth unemployment, to look at women unemployment. We have done that, Andy, through the support of grant money that was given for youth entrepreneurship development. We have done that to ensure that every single person in South Africa of a working age that is unemployed get a specific grant of 350 rand per month for the duration of the particular phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. That is apart from your normal social security basket that we give for people living with disabilities, old age citizens, and of course your child support grant. And that is a part of your normal social relief of distress for those indigent families that suffers and that is conflicted by chronic poverty. So in terms of the substantive basket of social protection, what we are saying here as South Africa is that we have overstretched the limiters test in terms of being a caring government. Secondly, of course, unemployment is not only a South African challenge, Andy. It's a historic challenge for the African continent. And what we have actually envisaged in terms of the National Development Plan of South Africa, we aspire to get a unemployment economic growth rate of 6% to end unemployment. That is what we have aspired. As we are speaking, 3 weeks back, we have received the information from our economic institution that South Africa is on an upwards economic growth of 3.2%. Whilst we are reimagining and recalibrating the economy, here comes a carefully planned plan to dilute the authority of the state and to, of course, side mayhem in terms of investor confidence with completely no regard for the poor. If any person, Andy, had any regard for the unemployed, for those living in poverty, at no stage would you be part of engineering and economic sabotage against the state. Because the state in South Africa, remember, it's a pro-poor state. 27 years old, pro-poor, work on unemployment, work on making sure poverty is poor, work on making sure the inequality gap, we are actually narrowing it. And that's why we are saying with the line the president have given, it's very unfortunate that there is those that have, are living amongst us that have made it their burden to try to actually paralyze the state in South Africa.
Minister, I will touch on the economic indicators later on in the program, but let me ask you this. Critics state that it appears that the scale of the unrest took the South African government by surprise, with police overwhelmed and unable to cope, forcing the deployment, of course, as you said earlier, of soldiers to back them up. Your comment, was the South African government prepared? And why, again, as critics allege, did it take so long to get things back under control?
Yes, I think let's be factual and let's also agree that any debate, there must be an element of self-criticism in it. So I want to be self-critical that indeed we have not expected that there will be those amongst us that will engage in very well-sourced, intelligent acts of economic sabotage. We have not expected that, because the creed and the cradle of the people of South Africa is a creed and a cradle that is premised on Ubuntu, that I am because you are. So the question about neighborhood, the question about a brotherhood, sisterhood, and a familyhood has always been what even drove the anti-apartheid struggle and the unity of purpose of the South African people. So we have not been prepared for this type of internal engineering process to try to undermine the forward movement of the democratic state. So I think that is the first thing. The second issue, and we have to be very sensitive and careful not to be provoked through our law enforcement agencies to just engage in a process of trying to rein in ordinary people that have been infused into a particular program through the death, the loss of any lives. Because if any of the South African law enforcement agencies have become hard-handed, we could have actually seen a very high loss of death. So at all times, the call from President Ramaphosa to the law enforcement agencies is that at all times do what is in the best interest of our people and apply your tools of being active members of law enforcement and using situation analysis. So we could not have here a sharp fall that have occurred during the time of the apartheid government. So we had to be very careful. And of course, Andy, we want to make a broad acknowledgement that, of course, as it relates to this type of engineer type of social upheaval that have actually taken place, that we will draw some certain lessons out of this type of actions. Because like I've said, any experience, negative or positive, it ultimately must present itself as an opportunity and as a learning curve.
So, Diem, you talked earlier about the rule of law and how South African government adheres to that. Now, media reports have indicated that the South African Police Service, or SAPS, has made more than 3,400 arrests in connection with the civil unrest. Almost 1,700 suspects have been admitted as remand detainees, and already overcrowded correctional facilities are apparently struggling to accommodate those awaiting trial. So how will South Africa's judicial system be able to cope?
Well, I think firstly, Andy, let's first indicate that, look, at all times we must be proponents of upholding a rules-based order. So this state in South Africa is a state that is embedded as it relates to a rules-based order. The fact that law enforcement have actually affected an arrest of people that have either looted material from retail stores, or people that have been part of the brain trust behind this failed attempt to engage an insurrection in South Africa. That is an obligation from law enforcement agencies. What we have requested is that your security cluster, your National Prosecuting Authority, is of course working very closely with your judiciary to ensure that those that have been reported to have committed a serious criminal offenses against the state gets urgently an opportunity to present themselves in front of the judiciary. So I think what we are saying to you, Andy, is that there is those acts of what you call your common criminality that has taken place. The South Africa jurisprudence allow for a particular point of view how to process those that have engaged in those type of crimes. But then those that are actually in the optics of having been the key proponents of committing a more sophisticated economic crime against the South African people will of course get a particular a lens through which the jurisprudence of course will look at them. So where we are as a government and is that we have a system in place, prosecuting authority complemented by the South African police services, of course, to bring any alleged perpetrator to book through the corridors of the South African judiciary system.
You're watching The Chase Special, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program. Our discussion this evening, South Africa Unrest, the aftermath. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN. Remember, as usual, we would like to hear from you. So join this discussion on our Twitter handle at ZTN News and on our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV network. So please make sure we hear your voice. Our special guest tonight is Alvin Botes. He is South Africa's Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. DM, the unrest has apparently caused some form of food insecurity in various small towns in KwaZulu-Natal and people in parts of cities who are still struggling to access food as supply chains were disrupted. For example, it was reported that, and I quote, some 20,000 tons of frozen chicken is reportedly stuck on ships in and around Durban Harbour, with more on the way. How concerned is the South African government about food shortages, and what measures are being taken to protect the supply and delivery of food safely to citizens? Furthermore, what efforts are being made to reopen supply chains?
Yes, no, thank you very much for that very pertinent questions, which requires a particular level of seriousness. Look, Andy, I think let's first make this statement that men make their own history, but they do not make it in circumstances that is self-selected. So they make it in circumstances given and transmitted from the past. What that says, and the issues about South Africa being a pivotal corridor of economic trade, it's an important aspect I'm making. And I think it confirmed what you have said. When a perpetrator target a harbor or a port of entry, which is a corridor for economic trade, that cannot be a submission that says that is a common crime. No, it's not a common crime. It's a crime that is well thought out with particular economic intelligence accompanying to make sure that we undermine the issues of economic regeneration. We undermine the integrity of these of SADC trade corridors, because the ports, Andy, does not necessarily only feed the South African populace. The ports in South Africa is corridors for economic trade that feeds the people of Zimbabwe, it feeds Zambia, it feeds Botswana, it feeds Namibia, all the countries in the Southern African Development Community. So what we should characterize what the unfortunate incident that have plagued South Africa is actually an attempt to undermine the entirety of food security within the SADC region. So I think we do acknowledge that. What we have done, and our president had a 2 days back, a meeting with captains of industry in the private sector to look at how best private sector can work urgently with government and to expedite the issues about food security, to make sure that the issues about the ports gets opened up, to make sure that your main national roads, in particular your N3, it's open for trade. So what we have done in the past is to make sure in a very accelerated manner, there has been the social compact with private sector in South Africa to look at the issues of food security. And of course, the Minister of International Relations, Dr. Naledi Pandor, has been quite concerned as it relates to how these economic corridors of trade gets adversely affected. And we have worked with our Minister of Transport to ensure that we actually are able to ensure that there's an accelerated movement of goods and foods in particular throughout the entirety of the SADC region.
Deputy Minister, Zimbabwe, like the majority of Southern African development countries, relies heavily on South Africa trade routes. You mentioned this, not only for imports, but also for exports. And the major port of Durban, as you said, is only now slowly getting back to full operation. But reports indicate that there is still a major backlog of ships waiting to berth. The economic effect of the unrest has spread outside of South Africa's borders and is and has economically affected your neighbors. So your views, what has been the effect on confidence and investment in and into South Africa? The effect on what economists call an already struggling economy? And how much will it cost for reconstruction?
Yes, look, let me first state to the Zimbabwean people that the bilateral relationship between these two countries is very key and critical in our Pan-African outlook. For example, and the South African exports to Zimbabwe in 2020 amounted to 36.2 billion rands, whilst imports amounted to 1.8 billion rand, placing South Africa amongst Zimbabweans' top 5 trading partners on the continent. So we are, of course, a prominent member in the South African Customs Union. That actually is the institution, Andy, that actually direct your economic trade among SADC, but also with the rest of the African continent and in some instances, different regions of the world. So we are, of course, concerned that firstly, that our neighbors had adversely been affected because of the negative economic situation that have occurred in South Africa. And that's why we have immediately tried to recalibrate our economic structure to make sure that we are energized, we are firm and resilient amongst everything that has taken place. Because our immediate concern, Andy, our immediate concern is the food security of the people of South Africa and that of the neighboring countries, in particular in SADC. Of course, you have made the important issue about what is our sense as it relates to investor climate, investor confidence. And it is a fact, Andy, that we are, of course, quite concerned. But what we do present as South Africa to your international investment community, we do represent Africa's most industrialized economy. We do present a very strong financial sector, but why we came under this type of siege, economic siege for that matter, is because of the resilience of the South African state institutions, and in particular, the government's posture as it relates to the rule of law is concerned. Now, this protest, if you can recall, has in part been generated because of a judicial type of decisions taken by the Constitutional Court. And we have underpinned and stood firm in support of the independent judiciary and the type of decisions independently that the justice system in South Africa must be allowed to take, Andy. And that is what we present to the international community, that in South Africa, if you do invest, your investment is safe because there's a rules-based order. Your investment will be underwritten in the laws of the country, in particular your Companies Act. So in South Africa, you are not going to have necessarily a situation where your investment is not paying dividends. It's going to bring about dividends, but it is also going to be in a repository where there's a rules-based order in place. And if we, Andy, as the government, got adversely affected because of our principle and resilient stand as it relates to respecting the judiciary in South Africa, then we rather in that context than to try to undermine what the forebears of the South African freedom struggle fought for.
Minister, I want to ask you again that the amount, because I asked you how much do you think it will cost for reconstruction. You heard in my opening 1.37 billion or around there US dollars just in KwaZulu-Natal alone, and we're still estimating the cost in Gauteng. So it's a two-part question. One, have you any idea how much the reconstruction costs will be? And also, more importantly, who is actually going to pay for the reconstruction costs? Will it be the South African taxpayer?
Yes, no, thank you very much, Andy. Look, I think for purposes of clarity, we have a team that are still doing what we call cost actualization to try to determine what is the exact cost as it relates to the economy is concerned. Secondly, we have a multidisciplinary team that are looking at what is the cost of this looting as it relates to your local government infrastructure is concerned. And thirdly, we are obviously look in terms of how our trade figures gets impinged upon. So from where I am sitting, that we had indicated that initial figures will exceed 1 billion rand in South Africa, but we are still validating it, and we have tasked a team of ministers from multidisciplinary type of departments to actually take the cabinet in confidence. And my understanding, and once the cabinet has been cleared around the cost implication, the president will take South Africa into confidence. But I think it is substantial. It's significant. It's a deterrent to reimagining the South African economy, to reimagining the emergence of the South African, the Southern African development community's economy. And I'm saying so because what happened in South Africa, Andy, it directly affects our neighbors, given the type of economic corridors that are existing within SADC. So the grievance of the South African leadership around the unfortunate incident that have taken place, that should be a grievance, of course, that will find common cause amongst many leaders in SADC. The question that you have asked is a very pivotal question, is who pays when members of the public ransack public infrastructure, loot private companies? Ultimately, Andy, the ordinary person will adversely be affected because it means our economic recovery will necessarily not be as speedily as how it has been at a 3.3% trajectory. You know that the investment climate will be frowned upon, and your rating agencies will look at South Africa with a particular circumspect. If we don't get the positive ratings that we are working very hard to achieve, who gets adversely affected is the ordinary South African, Andy. So that is the problem of this type of a mayhem. There will be massive insurance claims that will be submitted in terms of the insurance industry. That type of burden will then be in turn given back to the consumers. So if a person have had a retail store that has been looted, they would submit their claims to your insurance industries, to your financial sector. The premiums in the long term will then increase. So your ordinary consumers, your ordinary public gets adversely affected by these challenges that unfortunately have taken place, Andy.
Minister, I want to talk about your relationships, particularly with SADC, because the recent unrest, has it changed or altered South Africa's relationships with your fellow African countries? I mean, you did talk about the strong and excellent bilateral ties between Zimbabwe and South Africa. So has this affected that standing of South Africa in the communities, not only SADC, Africa, but also the world?
Yes, look, let's first end that South Africa, before we are anything else, we are African state. We have a special characteristic because of colonialism of a special type and because of apartheid. So we have a special characteristic in South Africa. But we are, as an African state, as Namibia, we are as an African state as Lesotho, as Tanzania. We find our upbringing as a free people from the role that our neighbors has played, in particular during the very dark days of apartheid through the frontline states. So before we are anything else, when we look at in the north of Africa, and you speak about our countries of Egypt, when we speak about countries of Algeria, we are as African as the rest of the other 55 AU member states. So there's absolutely no disclaimer. Would our peers in Africa look at us through eyes that is less favorable than how they have looked at us yesteryear? It's a loud no, Andy. It's a loud no because South Africa have shown that it is not immune to ordinary societal challenges. We have huge unemployment, we have poverty, we have inequality. Those three key issues, it matters that affect the entirety of the African nation as a collective. So our peers are not going to look at us through a less favorable optics, and I am absolutely unequivocal about that, because when any neighboring state in SADC goes through some difficulties, we don't look at them through the scope of being critical. What we do is to engage in a process of support in the spirit and in advancing our Ubuntu diplomacy. Of course, the question what you have asked is, how will the other part of the world, how will your more industrialized north look at South Africa? Will it look different to South Africa than yesterday? I think what they will appreciate is that we stood firm as a government on the resilience of state institutions, and that is a critical issue that everyone must start to speak about. That because we stood resilient, we protected the integrity of the judiciary in South Africa, we were subjected by some amongst us that sought to dilute the role of the judiciary to a very unfortunate social upheaval. So what the international community will look at us is to say, no, in South Africa, there's a rule of law, there's strong state institutions, and you have a leadership in cabinet led by President Ramaphosa that stands for principle. And that principle and policy, and it comes from the original Lodestar document entitled the Freedom Charter that says all shall be equal before the law. And that is the message at the central level that we as the executive in South Africa wish to communicate to everyone.
Deputy Minister, my final question. The World Bank, in its 13th edition of the bank's South Africa Economic Update, released earlier this week, has warned of continued social unrest in South Africa if the government does not speed up the implementation of economic reforms to address inequality. The World Bank Country Director for South Africa said, and I quote, South Africa needed to review its policies to address unemployment, which was at 32.6%. At least 1.4 million people had lost their jobs by the end of last year, representing an 8% contraction in aggregate employment. The World Bank projects the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, growth to rebound to 4% this year. However, GDP growth was projected to slow to 2.1% next year and to 1.5% in 2023, suggesting that the average South African will be worse off in 2023 compared to 2019. The World Bank said South Africa is set to emerge from the COVID-19 crisis weaker than when it entered it, despite its solid response to the pandemic. Deputy Minister, let me be blunt. Does South Africa's ANC government have a cohesive vision to rebuild and provide a viable future for the current and next generation of your citizens?
Let me be unequivocal, Andy. In South Africa, we have what we call the National Development Plan that envisage an economic growth of 6%. You are correct. 3 weeks back, we were standing firm 3% economic trajectory as part of the 500 billion rand presidential stimulus that has been unrolled by President Ramaphosa. We are saying the presidential employment stimulus is what you call a force multiplier, Andy, that we were on an upwards trajectory. Secondly, what everyone should recognize is, apart from your economy pre-COVID-19 pandemic, there is a new African multilateral economic instrument at our disposal entitled the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The first free trade agreement, and if you can recall, it came into effect on 1st January 2021. It sought to negate the fact that amongst the 55 African states, you only have a 16% economic trade that takes place amongst your 55 African countries. Africa only contributed 3% of world economic trade. So your African Continental Free Trade Agreement is supposed to dialectically have benefited the South African economy, the economy of SADC, South African Customs Union, and the entirety of the African continent. So we have put in place what we call firm building blocks to ensure that as we rise out of COVID-19 pandemic, not only as South Africa, but as the SADC region rise together with South Africa out of a distressed economic situation. So our future, our economic future is interlinked with the economic future of Zimbabwe. It's interlinked with the economic future of the Congo, of Tanzania, of Malawi. So I think that is a very key and important point. The third issue, it is correct that the World Bank, the figures that I have seen have slightly revised our economic fortunes downwards for 2022. But that has not substantively taken into consideration the type of economic recalibration between South Africa and the rest of Africa that are supposed to have actually taken place. So where I am sitting is that we are working day and night as the South African government to ensure, Andy, we make poverty poorer. We want to ensure that tomorrow you have less poverty than today. Secondly, we are working and we are really rolling out massive public employment programs under the presidential stimulus program for our young people, because South Africa, like the rest of Africa, have what we call a youth bulge that should either be seen as a massive opportunity or, if not properly addressed, as a economic pitfall. We see the youth bulge as an economic dividend, and where we are upskilling our young people to ensure through your African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we are able to engage in significant local beneficiation and manufacturing producing type of industry. So we are confident as a people. We are not pompous. We are confident that our economic recovery is interlinked to the economic fortunes of SADC and to the rest of the African continent.
I think on that note, we have come to the end of the Chase Special this evening. You've been watching our virtual discussion, South African Unrest, the Aftermath. I would like to thank my special guest this evening, Alvin Botes. He's South Africa's Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. Deputy Minister, thank you very much for appearing as our guest on the Chase Special tonight.
Thank you very much, Andy.
This broadcast was brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN. Well, I'm Andy Hodges. Good night, and please, you all be safe.